Hello, good evening. Welcome once again. And this is more than anything a vlog for myself. So, this vlog, I want to talk about something about the paper that I'm writing. It's on the judgment of God, and oftentimes we think of the judgment of God as going at the end of the days, and um, coherent imagery of the gospel, the judgment of God is found in Isaiah chapter 6, I think, and of course in the book of Revelation. But I'd like to look at one aspect of the judgment of God. Now, the judgment of God is closely related to the idea of salvation, of course. You are going to be saved if God chooses you to be saved, and you are going to be punished if God chooses you to be punished. And of course, the whole thing about Christ being sent is there as well. And so, before I delve into this topic, let me share some highlights in my life right now. So, 4 days ago, today is what is today? Tuesday. On Thursday, I moved back here in the campus, in the IS campus. The move is prompted by, well, I credit my wife. She knows me very well, and she noticed that even when I resumed classes again for my PhD, I wasn't very focused. I didn't want to do it. I don't know if I still. Now I'm here, of course, I have to do it, but I will be perfectly honest with you. I'm not yet there. I'm not yet in the mood, in the state of being excited and motivated to finish this. But we're getting there step by step. It's a lot of effort to do that, and so I thank my wife for the understanding, the opportunity. Um, well, since I'm here, I think I can do a lot more of this. So that's about it. That's the personal stuff. Romans chapter 3 is where I want to talk about the judgment of God. The judgment of God and His righteousness, of course. Let me read the text. What advantage, Paul says, then, is there in being a Jew, or what value is there in circumcision? By the way, this is the NIV. Much in every way. First of all, the Jews have been entrusted with the very words of God. What if some of the Jews were unfaithful? Will their unfaithfulness nullify God's faithfulness? Not at all. Let God be true and every human being a liar, as it is written, so that you may be proved right when you speak and prevail when you judge. Now, Paul is now going into this whole topic of God being the judge, and in that judgment, he is said to be righteous. Verse 5, but if our unrighteousness brings out God's righteousness more clearly, what shall we say? That God is unjust in bringing His wrath on us? I am using a human argument, Paul says. Certainly not. If that were so, how could God judge the world? The righteousness of God is, as I mentioned earlier, closely tied to salvation. And there are three major views on God's righteousness, at least the way Paul expounded on them in his writings. Basically, the three views are: first, it's the legal condition, it's the legal status that God imputes or imparts, depending on the nuance. on the sinners. So that's the first view, that the righteousness of God is it's a state, essentially. The second is the righteousness of God is his indignation. Sorry, his indignation um, against sin. He hates sin, and so that's his righteousness. He's righteous because he hates sin. So you can say that that is kind of like an attribute of God. That is a view that righteousness is an attribute of God instead of it being, in the first one, a state. And the last one, of course, is the righteousness of God is uh, basically his salvific action in saving those who are not supposed to be saved, human beings like us. No one is saved. So those are the three views on God's righteousness. Essentially, these three views converge on and universally agree on the idea that the righteousness of God has something to do with uplifting the sinner. Basically, salvation. So the righteousness of God is tied to salvation. God is righteous, his judgment is righteous because he will offer salvation to the sinners, to those who do not deserve them. But Paul here says, in verse 5 especially, are we going to say, I'm paraphrasing, that God is unrighteous in bringing his wrath on us? And then he says, of course not. So the idea is that the opposite is true. That even if God inflicts wrath on us, that very action is righteousness for God. So suppose the idea is this, and this is essentially my hypothesis in the paper. We understand that God is righteous when he saves people who are not supposed to be saved. That much is clear. But suppose, for a second, suppose that no one, in spite of everything that God has done, and the Son has shed his blood for us, but suppose that no one is going to be saved, and that all of human race is going to be inflicted punishment by God. So then the basis of righteousness on salvation falls apart, because if there is no salvation of human beings and even fallen angels, if you want to extend it to them, then the definition that we listed down earlier essentially fail. The definitions, those three definitions, because no one is going to be saved. There is no salvation. No one is going to be saved. That's just a supposition, of course, but it's a mental exercise that allows us to look a little bit deeper into the character of God, and a closely tied notion is the sovereignty of God. I think what Paul is talking about here in verse 5 and 6, of course, is what we call in theology. I'm not in theology, I'm in biblical studies, but in systematic theology they call this apophatic theology. Another term is via negativa, meaning defining the attribute of God by the negative, by he is not, for example, the affirmative way, or cataphatic theology, cataphatic theology. Sorry. One example is God is love. God is a God of order. Those positive attributes of God. Now, apophatic theology or apophatic attribute is God is not, and then something negative that God isn't. So that's the idea. So God is not a God of disorder, for instance. God is not a God of dishonesty, something like that. Um, of course, some deeper studies on the apophatic, cataphatic theologies that God is knowable or God is unknowable, those kind of things. But that's a completely different thing, and that's in the realm of systematic theology. But here, in Romans chapter 3, verse 5, Paul is doing something along that line, apophatic theology, via negativa. What are we going to say? That God is unrighteous in inflicting wrath on us? And of course, his answer is no. So the statement of Paul is essentially, the apophatic statement is essentially that God is not unrighteous. Of course, the opposite, semantic opposite, is true, that God is righteous even during or in spite of the seemingly unrighteous thing of inflicting wrath and not saving people. And so this is where I am right now. I'm doing some research on this, of course, on what others have done in the passage, but that is something that should help us, I think, to help us understand who God is. It's a little bit different from how we understand God, because as I mentioned earlier, we usually talk about the righteousness of God in terms of his salvific work for us. But here Paul is also saying, no, he is righteous even when he inflicts wrath. Of course, I am distinguishing righteousness from justice. We understand the justice of God in inflicting those who deserve them. That's what justice is, right? So justice is when you inflict something, when you punish something, or somebody who deserves to be punished. That's just justice. Or when you save somebody who ought to be saved. That's the idea of being just, being fair, being what is needed to be done. Needs to be done. But righteousness is different. Righteousness is different from justice. They are related, but they are different concepts, even in systematic theology. So the righteousness of God is typically understood in terms of salvation, that God is righteous because we are unrighteous, and yet he saves us. He takes care of us, and that makes him righteous. But I argue, and I think Paul is arguing also, even if God doesn't do those things, he is still righteous. Not just, but righteous. And so I hope this little study on Romans chapter 3, verse 4, 5, and 6, these three verses, can help us a little closer to understand who God is. Definitely this is something that is helping me cope up with my current situation. I am learning every day. I am struggling every minute to do what I am supposed to do. But that's just what it is. I think all of us struggle in one way or another. Thank you very much if you have gone through this. It's the 15-minute mark, and I wish to keep this vlog as short as I could, but I can't promise that. Okay, good evening everyone, and may God be with you all. Bye bye.